To chair the second session, I'd like to introduce Elaine Brick. Elaine is a civil engineer and she's an associate director with ACOM. She's carried out surveys of cyclists. Last year, a survey of the needs of over 2,000 cyclists. She's worked in transportation planning. She's currently working in Singapore with the land authority there, helping them look at modal shift. So I'd like to hand over to Elaine now to chair the second session.
Thank you. Thanks, Mayne, and thank you to the Dublin Cycling Campaign for inviting me to chair the European Perspective session on cycling. So I suppose just to start the session on a positive note, in my experience, I think that Dublin in the past few years, whether we believe it or not, is actually up there in it's on the international radar for best practice in cycling. Now, the recent success of the Dublin bike scheme is obviously leading this. And, you know, I think the challenge will be for us here in harnessing that recent growth and turning it into something positive and long-term modal shift. I suppose just looking at international perspectives, wherever we go around the world, every local authority, whether you're in Brazil or Australia, Vietnam, everybody wants to emulate Northern Europe in terms of their cycling policy. Our own Irish visitors to Holland and to Denmark, everybody comes home and they're saying, oh, you know, they've got a very positive image of cycling in these countries and they give out then, why can't we do that here? You know, and I suppose that's actually caused a bit of a pain in the neck for our local authorities because we all know what challenges and the decades of investment that's behind a cycling culture like that. Irish visitors aren't the only people who come away from Northern Europe with this desire for greater segregation for cyclists, better safety, better cycling culture. In Australia, for example, just sharing some of my own experiences, you know, they want to emulate Northern Europe as well, but the culture there for cycling, in my experience, was very different, and it kind of brings in the gender gap here a little bit as well. I'm a cyclist with the past 10 or 15 years. When I lived in Australia, I found it very, very male-dominated. In fact, the major junctions in the CBD in the morning looked like a leg of the Tour de France. Everybody, I was actually roaring laughing on the bike. You'd look around, sponsored jerseys everywhere, all the shades on, and they're all competing for their best personal time that morning going to work. I have to say it was intimidating. 15 years of cycling experience still daunted me because even though we had segregated cycle lanes, greenways effectively along the River Yarra in Melbourne going to work in the morning, I would actually get male cyclists shouting at me to get out of the way. They'd see a dress and a pair of heels and they're like, where does she think she's going? She shouldn't be using this. It was almost the attitude, you know. And I was delighted on several occasions to see a big pile-up of lycra-clad cyclists up on top of each other because they were cycling so close to each other and trying to overtake each other. I was delighted passing them out and just looking down at them. Caring, obviously, but, you know, they didn't care. They didn't care about me when they nearly knocked me off my bike 50 metres previously. Similarly, in Singapore, you know, similar challenges there. They want to emulate Northern Europe. But how can they emulate Northern Europe when you've got 90% humidity, 30 degrees, hovering around that every day of the year? And, in fact, you know, a culture where it's so affluent that people on bikes are viewed as the lower class in society, you know. It's all about European luxury cars. So my point here is that local culture is very important. It's very important for us to look at the international perspective, but it's very important for us to take that meaningfully, understand it and apply it to Ireland and apply it to our local physical, social, political and economic circumstances. So the speakers we've lined up in this session will give us very good insight into that. First up, we have Kevin Mayne, who is the Development Director for the European Cycling Federation at the moment. Now, Kevin is very well placed to tell us about the European perspective, working with various European countries, and he's got his eye on the ball and seeing what works where, and maybe can shed some information as to what we can do here. Kevin joined the European Cycling Federation after 14 years as Chief Executive of CTC, which is the UK's national cyclist organisation. He has advised government in the UK on cycling priorities, policies and spending programmes, which has amounted to over €200 million during the life of the board. Kevin, I'm very interested to look into your blog, which is called idonotdespair.com. I'm sure we'll all be logging onto that with interest later. So welcome, Kevin.
Morning. First duty of a speaker, not to overrun, so I've been warned, so I'll take that on board. Second duty of a speaker, apparently at this conference, is not to use PowerPoint. And I'm sadly going to fail that test, but I'm going to say a few words of welcome with a gorgeous image instead of words, which will do me quite nicely. Really appreciate the invitation to be here. I'm a bit of a fraud. I've been working at the European level probably for 4 or 5 years with ECF, through things like the Villa City conferences and that kind of thing, and I actually joined ECF staff in the last few months. But when the topic was also participation and gender, I actually kind of wanted to switch my focus, because certainly in my role at the UK, I think the project of which I'm absolutely most proud is our diversity programme that CTC ran, which is probably the largest social inclusion diversity project anybody's ever done in the world. We spent about €10 million over 4 years and brought about 50,000 people from ethnic minorities. We did gender projects, we did disability projects, offenders, drug abusers, mental health patients. And I have to say, I know many of you are cycle campaigners just like I am. If ever you are tired and jaded and you really think it's going nowhere, go and join a project like Anna's. Go and do something around this, because when you put someone on a bicycle who has suffered from mental health, who has suffered from isolation, and then a week later they've actually kind of discovered mobility, it's not cycling. You're actually making them fly. It is something, it's the few times I actually get tears in my eyes. And you know, a disability session can be absolutely extraordinary, because it's not about disability, it becomes about ability. So I think when we talk participation, we've got to talk the big numbers, we've got to talk modal share, we want to get millions on bikes, but I would encourage you to take that moment of refreshment, because it's really, really special. And I will refer to some of, I guess, my views on that in this discussion, particularly about gender. So kind of onwards, participation gender gap. I think we should talk about cycling and gender, and actually cycling, gender and children. If we're all cycle campaigners, and frankly I regard anybody who works in local government and cycling as a campaigner who got themselves a suit and a haircut. Because we should be amongst friends, and there are few enough cycling people working with professional careers. We're a family in doing this. And the really exciting thing about addressing gender and age and diversity is the fact that actually it takes you to different places in the policy agenda. I think that's absolutely crucial. You know, you need to talk about lifelong education. It's a different bit of government. You need to talk about economic isolation and welfare. It's a different part of government. If you need to talk about health, it's a different part of government. Let's not isolate ourselves in this transport ghetto. And talking about real people, not cyclists. Cyclists are not people, discuss. People might be cyclists. And if we take this attitude to mobility, then we go and look at real people. And that's the key thing. And as a behaviour change science, changing people's behaviour actually says, go deal with the real world. Don't go messing about in a world that's inhabited by middle-aged men in lycra. Even worse, middle-aged Australian men in lycra, the scariest creature on the planet. Frankly, this is the slide I hate to put up. This is why do women, why do children? Because that makes me the sexist pig. That makes me the problem. I've immediately ghettoised a particular community as needing special treatment. And any kind of particular person, a feminist bent in the room says, right, that's him written off. You can leave now. Sorry, I live in the real world. My job's behaviour change. And if I go over to behavioural science, it says, what are the attitudes of these people? What are their behaviours? And what does behavioural science tell us about changing their behaviours? Society patronises. But actually, in the real world, some of those behaviours mean that female obesity is now starting with 9-year-olds. That's actually scary. In the UK, we know that physical activity in girls peaks at 9. It used to peak at about 14. It now peaks at 9. You have 14-year-old girls who can't pass the physical activity test for 65-year-olds that we used to use. The test is, can you walk a flight of stairs without using the handrail? Pausing for breath part of the way up. That's just extraordinary. And it is very, very gender specific. There's not a shadow of doubt that it's there. Fabulous. I'm glad you met Philip Darnton last year, some of you. Philip brought this phrase. Mum holds the key to the bike shed. Children's behaviour and travel behaviour is, in vast majority of society in the world, controlled by mothers. Dads are actually usually more relaxed about risk, it appears. They'll let the kids go out. But actually, in a maternalistic society, the worry and the decisions about children's behaviour are often made by mothers. If mothers do not experience cycling as a safe activity, it will not be part of children's lives. Or for that matter, walking. Or for that matter, taking the bus to school. So it's not purely about cycling. So we bring that set together to talk about behaviour change. We talk about behaviour change that's been successfully exploited by other sectors to their commercial aim. If you want to be the perfect parent, this is your image. And other sectors have done the most amazing job bringing that forward, and we should watch what they do. It matters, yeah, we've got to take the Netherlands for a moment, but the key thing is, in the Netherlands, more women cycle than men. It's not just parity, it's more. And the key thing is, it goes back to the point, it's about the journeys made. It's about a preponderance of local journeys, and it's actually also about economic circumstances. In one-car families, man takes car. Okay, that's the brutal reality. I was delighted to learn in Spain. In Spain, the highest preponderance of bus users are women, because in a one-car society, man takes car. So we're offering choices. You might hate it as a prejudice. We're behavioural scientists. I'm not here to deal with the prejudices, I'm here to get people on bikes. The other interesting one is that point about child-free streets. If our children cannot go outside, we don't have healthy cities. And if people in South America are saying that, and in Asia are saying that, and in much of Europe we recognise that, that is a key indicator for any civilised society. And we can carry that with us. That's a moral human right. It's not about transport. Get real. It's about the kind of children we want. And we can harness that to make ourselves better cycling advocates. Like to sew a nice spot, but then it comes together. So this approach to diversity, the first key point is it can take you to a whole load of other agendas. It can take you to the obesity agenda, the pollution agenda, the economic agenda, prevention of crime agenda. And as cycling, if we genuinely want to be 10% of society, not 10% of journeys, we want to be 10% of society, then we can use these other agendas. And frankly, they're a lot better funded than cycling. They're a lot better funded than transport. There are other things going on. Nobody goes into politics to be transport minister. Frankly, who would want to be transport minister? The buses don't run, the cars crash, your budget gets cut. You want to be in something sexy like education. You know, please, name the most famous transport politician in history. I only could think of one. It was Mussolini. He fixed the Italian railways. Anybody remember Mussolini because he fixed the Italian railways? No. So, if you want political support, we've got to move on. We ghettoise ourselves, and we've learnt that across Europe. And in diversity, we harness a lot of other values and political values, and I think it is worth remembering that the Dutch cycling culture we saw today started with a rebellion of the mothers. That sign says, "Stop child murder." The Dutch Cycling Campaign formed after the Stop the Kindermoord campaign gained ground, and the Dutch decided enough was enough. But politically, frankly, mothers are much more powerful than cyclists. The sense of a human right to be safe on the streets, to have mobility, to have access to employment, to have economic value, is more powerful than cycling. And in societies that grasp this, and frankly, even in a recession, if you need to move on, that's one of the key tools you've got to use. So, the main point on gender I wanted to bring out is why. The answer is more than anything else because gender and diversity enable us to reset the agenda around people, not cyclists. And that is the kind of first holding point. So, without being a of false pretences, I then asked the question briefly, well, come on Kevin, we've hooked you over here. What's going on that we can actually catch on to at maybe a European level that might be useful in Dublin and in Ireland that we should take forward? I'm actually able to catch up a bit in this session because people like Damien have already done some of the key messages because they've gone out and listened. So I will repeat some of that stuff. But at the end of the day, that political commitment to your kind of people is the thing that glues it all together. Because things can change in policy terms. You can get growth. Even when money's short, you can get policies changed, whether it be strict liability, whether it be speed. Some of these things are cheap. You know, the decision to allow bikes on metros is a policy decision. It's not a financial decision. Essentially, you've got to start there. Then certainly if you want to do diversity and gender and those kind of issues, I then come back to it's about the people. Do you actually understand where the next 10,000 cyclists in Dublin are going to come from? Because if you don't, every penny you spend from now and the next 5 years will be wasted. If there are 10,000 college students around this university and the hinterland that might be persuadable to travel, then please don't spend another penny anywhere else in Dublin. At this point, I'd probably better leave. But realistically, it's the old school kind of military exercise, count the heads out, count them back in again. And it encourages down, people are learning that corridor investments, single town investments, amazingly the Danes came to Britain to ask about the Cycling Towns programme. That was really scary. What they really wanted to know was how they got the political will to not have to spend the money everywhere. And the argument is because you've got to get a critical mass of investment and you can actually count the heads in those towns whose behaviour can be changed. And we have cities who understand that focused investment. And the money spent elsewhere that cities that didn't understand that, the fair idea, that money was probably wasted. And once we learn the lesson, we move on. So, if I'm going to look at your Irish situation and say what's going on in Europe, yes, if you want to be inspired, I can point you to the Netherlands and Denmark. But I can point you for inspiration. If I'm going to point you for practical measures, I'll just do... Anybody here think you can do Denmark next week in Ireland? Yes, somebody said yes. Sorry. Whoever you are, I assume you walked on water rather than splashed through it to get here, whoever said yes. But You know, there are many, many steps in different countries that can move the culture forward enormously. But you could do Holland and Denmark in one street, in one community, in one town to get to a certain point and then move on. Very few people actually can do that. So across Europe, I'm afraid most people are really struggling with the we're not Holland story. So you are actually in a big family of people who are not going to go straight to go and collect 200. The other reason for doing it this way is the so-called safety in numbers effect, which has been a lot of the cycling and road safety literature over recent years. And I hope people are familiar with it. I see people nodding. This sense of if you get cycling walking to a certain level, you get to a break point and it gets safer. And the cyclist as part of traffic affects the behaviour of motorists, and a whole load of things happen, not all of which are understood. The one thing that is understood is it keeps working. And if we narrow this down literally to a neighbourhood level, we end up in the same position. Getting 10% mode share on one street is more valuable than getting 1% mode share increase everywhere, because you get behaviour change and role model and on that street and that corridor, and then you move on. And there's no doubt that the kind of neighbourhood level focused planning is a key message. Thank you. Had this one done already. Speed, frankly, great, but the wrong use of it. If you can convince people it's fun out there because you've made the distinction between killed and injured, you really aren't going to get anybody cycling. Which would you prefer, fried or boiled? The major reason for doing this, frankly, is the deterrent effect. What does it feel like to be passed at 40, 50, 60 kilometres an hour? What does it feel like to stand on the curb as a pedestrian and ask your children to cross? What does it feel like to know that a car could stop if you get it wrong, or that they've got no chance of stopping if you do get it wrong? Go back to the parental thing, more importantly, if your child gets it wrong. That's the key determinant. If my child gets this wrong, what will happen? In 20 mile an hour, 30, even a sensitive parent tends to think, you know what, it probably won't be too bad. So it's a key, it's a deterrent and promotional tool. Some other things you can do, cycle training, instantly. Ever met a man who thought he needed teaching to ride a bike? Come on, we're all far too macho for that. Actually, the biggest demand for adult cycle training in every country appears to be women. It's a very powerful tool. Cycle training for children, interestingly, the single most important customer is mum. All the stuff about bad behaviour. You know, as a mum, what about the bad behaviour around my children? Actually, mums love the idea their children have been taught to do it right. They probably suspect that they're not, particularly if they're boys, funnily enough. But there's a kind of moral engagement with, yeah, they've been trained. And it has an amazing, 85% of mums whose kids have been trained say they will let their child cycle more. And I'm talking 9 and 10-year-olds, not 12-year-olds. Get them younger, they can cycle to primary school. Get them at high school, too late. So the British scheme, the Swiss scheme, various others, they're doing 9 and 10-year-olds, not 12-year-olds. Kids are more malleable too at that age, and there's a lot of evidence that is the right age for their transport awareness. They actually have the skills at that age. Yeah, make it sexier, no question. Normal people, normal images, cycle chic. It's a great movement, but it's part of a bigger thing. There's programs called Bicycle Bells. There's a whole lot of others, but totally support that. Great one we did, you know, just again, engagement. Interesting one, this one. A lot of serious cyclists told me this was the most patronising thing CTC ever did. Why was it patronising? Because nobody's going to bother getting dressed up in their cycling gear and go out for a whole day just to do 5 miles. Talk about not understand. We were talking about people who were struggling to do 500 metres, to whom 5 miles was the most adventurous they could imagine going. And it works. So please, middle-aged men in Lycra, park your suspense. These kind of things, you have to start really with your audience. And there are a few things you shouldn't do. Cycle chic it isn't. I hope the photo's big enough on the right. I thought if you're asking for off-road cycle provision, be careful what you wish for. Amazingly, that one cost more to take out than it did to put in. It's just extraordinary how often we get it wrong. And yeah, I mean, quite what anybody thought the value of the cycle select scheme at the bottom actually was, I have no idea. But I go back to the point, if you have no idea whose behaviour you're going to change, and you actually know the cyclists that are going to use a skate, you're just going to carry on pouring money down the drain. And sadly, people are doing that all over Europe, but they're also doing things spectacularly well. Where to pause? For society's reasons, cycling remains one of the most powerful tools society can have in its armoury for dealing with multiple ills. Very few buy one, get six free options exist in real life. You know, do transport, get health. Do health, get sport. Do sport, get crime reduction, get tourism value, do all those kind of things. It's an extraordinary tool. I wish I could bring you a magic wand. I can tell you now that magic wand isn't the Netherlands. It's fantastic. But you have to go, you know, it's a 20-year project. But in tougher times, you have to be incredibly focused. And my main point about both gender and participation is these are people. Count them out, count them back in again. If you can actually find a scheme that changes the behaviour of 100 cyclists, then usually you get a payback of less than a year in tough economic times. Change the value of 1,000 cyclists, you're up there with the biggest bypass. Change the value of 2,000 cyclists, but you've actually got to get those 2,000 cyclists from somewhere. Their journey has to start, their journey has to finish. And that whole package is really, really powerful. And it will be different for women, it will be different for children, it will be different for people in poor communities, it will be different for the business community. So get extraordinarily focused, and it really is achievable. And I go back to my opening point, we have the power as a community to give people wings. That is a rare privilege, and I hope, even in tough, wet, rainy days when it's not going, I hope you feel inspired, because it's inspired me for many longer years than I care to remember. And I think it gives you an incredibly powerful tool for your communities to take forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. That was very inspiring. I think it was very good in just going back to the basics of understanding humans and people, as opposed to, you know, sometimes we kind of become a little bit over technical about cyclists, and we put ourselves up on a pedestal and, oh, cyclists' needs are so much different. Actually, we have human needs, and, you know, going back to that behaviour, identifying segments in society that are likely to change. And there's a lot of research, or there's a lot of work being done internationally, and is picking up in Ireland now through the Antashka, for example, and the Green Schools programme and things, identifying our target customers through segmentation and travel behaviour analysis. Another thing I picked up there was at the start you highlighted that we're a family of cyclists, and I think everybody here today, it's very important, because we have a mixture of whether you're in the public sector, whether you're in the private sector, politicians, whether, you know, whatever area you're in, it's about bringing that community together, and we can identify what works and coming together and working towards that shared goal. Just for a second, back to the Australians, I think Australia isn't the only place where we have this species. There's actually a lot of Australians living in Dublin, therefore. It's very interesting when you said about the women looking for cycle training more, because, I mean, if you're a woman at a junction in Dublin, a man will not allow you to take off before him. I mean, it's just so competitive. And then I mean, I'll always hang back and I enjoy the laugh at the back, watching the men trying to race each other to the next lights. What is it about? And, you know, just understanding that is, we'll never be able to harness that fully, but it's just interesting, the differences.